We are not asking for mercy. We are asking you to read your own law. The galaxy expected humanity to fight with weapons.
The vote took 4 seconds. That was the part nobody in the Assembly Registry ever thought to mention afterward when the histories were written and the humiliation had to be explained to people who had not been in the chamber to watch it happen. 4 seconds. That was how long it took the Kesh Assembly's Classification Committee to designate the entire human species Class 9, the lowest tier on a system that had governed the region for 11,000 years, a tier that existed for exactly one purpose: population control, pest management. The tier reserved for species whose numbers grew faster than the Assembly's actuaries were comfortable calculating. Humanity had been spacefaring for 31 years. In that time, it had settled 14 worlds, built 40 off-world stations, and grown, across all its colonies combined, from a starting population of 11 billion to just under 19. The Assembly's actuarial division ran the numbers, compared them against the standard growth curve for a newly contacted species, found humanity's curve sitting nearly 4 times above projection, and filed the classification the way it filed every classification, as a matter of routine administrative housekeeping rather than a matter anyone expected a species to actually notice. Species did not usually notice. Class 9 designations were applied, on average, to 1 or 2 newly contacted civilizations every century, almost always to species too primitive to understand what the classification meant, let alone to challenge it. The designation came with a containment quota, a maximum sustainable population the Assembly's registry permitted a Class 9 species to maintain, and a set of enforcement provisions that activated automatically if the quota was ever exceeded by more than a defined margin. The provisions were old. They had been written at a time when the Assembly's founding member species had faced genuine, existential threats from uncontrolled biological expansion among conquered populations, and they had never been updated, because no species classified under them in 11,000 years had ever survived long enough or organized well enough to demand that they be. Humanity found out about its classification the way it found out about most things that mattered, through an obscure trade office employee doing her job with more thoroughness than her job actually required. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 61 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Indiana who had spent 30 years teaching civics to teenagers who mostly didn't want to learn it, and who had taken in her retirement a modest and largely ceremonial post as a documentation liaison for Earth's newly established trade mission to the Kesh Assembly, a job that consisted primarily of reading translated regulatory filings that nobody more important had time to read. She read the classification notice on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at a borrowed desk in a borrowed office 3 light years from home, and she read it twice before she understood what she was looking at, because the language, translated into flat administrative English, did not sound like an insult. It sounded like an inventory record. Species designation, Class 9, containment tier, subject to standard population enforcement protocols upon exceeding registered quota by margin exceeding 12%. She looked up the definition of Class 9 in the Assembly's Public Reference Archive, which was, in the particular bureaucratic cruelty of institutions that had never expected to be questioned, entirely public and entirely unencrypted, because nobody had ever needed to hide it from a species too primitive to read it. Class 9. Colloquially, though never in official Assembly documentation, referred to among senior administrative staff, in a term that had survived unofficially for millennia despite repeated attempts to formalize it out of the record, as pest species. Ruth Calloway sat very still at her desk for a long time. Then she picked up a secure line and called the one person in the trade mission whose job title actually meant something. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had been posted to the Kesh Assembly for 6 years, long enough to understand that the Assembly's institutions ran on precedent, procedure, and paperwork far more than they ran on any grand ideological commitment to order. and long enough to know that a species which understood the paperwork better than the people who wrote it could, in theory, do things inside that system that the system's own architects had never imagined. She read the classification notice Ruth had flagged. She read the definition of Class 9. She read the enforcement provisions, all 40 pages of them, twice, and then she did something that would eventually be recorded, in a history none of them could yet imagine writing, as the first quiet decision in what became known as the longest appeal. She did not send an angry transmission back to RTH. She did not request military support, which did not exist in any form capable of reaching this far from home in any case. She requested instead through the Assembly's own formal channels, using the Assembly's own formal procedures, a complete copy of the classification methodology, the actuarial models behind it, and the full historical record of every prior Class 9 designation the Assembly had ever issued. This request was, under Assembly regulation, one that any classified species was entitled to make. It was also a request that no Class 9 species had ever made before, because no Class 9 species had ever survived contact with the Assembly's bureaucracy long enough, organized enough, or possessed the institutional patience required to think of making it. The Assembly's Records Office, staffed by a mid-tier archivist named Doral Vash who had processed exactly this kind of routine documentation request 11,000 times in his career and saw nothing unusual in processing an 11,001st, filed the response within the standard 90-day window, attached the full methodology, the full actuarial models, and the full historical record, and thought no more about it. It took Elena Vasquez's small team, working for the better part of a year, to find what they were looking for. What they found was this. The Class 9 containment quota was not, as the Assembly's founding charter claimed, calculated from any principle of ecological or resource sustainability. It was calculated, and had been calculated for 11,000 years, using a formula tied directly to a species military registration tier. A tier assigned not on the basis of actual demonstrated capability, but on the basis of a single self-reported assessment questionnaire, submitted once at first contact and never updated again for the entire duration of a species classification. Humanity's questionnaire had been completed, hurriedly and with almost no institutional guidance, by a junior diplomatic aide during the chaotic first weeks of contact, 31 years earlier. The aide, uncertain how to answer several of the more esoteric questions regarding fleet tonnage and strategic deterrent capability, had answered conservatively, in some cases leaving fields blank rather than guess, because he had assumed reasonably that someone more qualified would review and correct the filing before it became permanent. Nobody had. Under Assembly procedure, an unrevised first contact questionnaire became the permanent baseline record for a species military registration tier, unless formally amended through a process that required itself an official request that no Class 9 species had ever previously known to file. Elena Vasquez filed it. The amendment request was simple, procedurally unremarkable, and utterly devastating in its implications. It asked the Assembly's Classification Committee to review and update humanity's 31-year-old military registration questionnaire to reflect current verified capability, as was every classified species' explicit right under Assembly Regulation Section 14, Paragraph 9, a provision that had existed, unused, since the regulation's original drafting. The Classification Committee, seeing nothing unusual in a routine amendment request, scheduled the review for the following quarter and asked, as procedure required, for humanity to submit updated, verifiable documentation of its actual current capability across the categories the original questionnaire had left blank or answered conservatively. This was the moment, Elena Vasquez would say years later, when she understood exactly what kind of species humanity actually was, and exactly what kind of institutional patience it was capable of when given the smallest possible foothold. Because the request that went back to Earth was not a request for a display of force. It was a request for documentation. And documentation was something humanity, across 31 years of building 14 worlds and 40 stations under constant scrutiny from an assembly that had never once taken it seriously, had produced in genuinely staggering, meticulous quantity. Every colony census, every shipyard registry, every fleet manifest cross-referenced against every training record, every deployment log, every engineering specification for every vessel humanity had built in 3 decades of expansion that the Assembly had simply never bothered to ask about, because a Class 9 species military capability had never in 11,000 years mattered enough to anyone to warrant asking. The documentation package, when it was finally compiled, ran to over 400,000 pages. It was submitted in full exactly as procedure required, 3 days before the filing deadline by Ruth Calloway personally, who had by that point been quietly promoted on Elena Vasquez's recommendation from documentation liaison to senior registry coordinator, a Title T. Hat meant in practice that she was now the single most well-informed person in the entire Assembly regarding the precise letter of its own classification law. Doral Vash, the archivist who had processed the original amendment request without a second thought, was the first person at the Assembly to actually read the submission in full. He read it over the course of 4 days because it was long, and because something about the sheer density and specificity of the documentation made him increasingly unable to stop reading it. And on the 5th day he did something that was not, strictly speaking, part of his job description. He flagged the file for priority review by the full classification committee, rather than allowing it to move through the standard automated processing queue, because he had concluded, reading page after page of humanity's actual demonstrated capability, that whatever automated system had originally classified this species as a pest tier population problem had been working from information that bore almost no resemblance to reality. The Classification Committee convened an emergency session 11 days later. It was the first time in the Assembly's recorded history that a Class 9 species registration amendment had ever received emergency review status. Grand Registrar Kelvath Sorn, who had chaired the Classification Committee for 19 years, and had in that time presided over the routine unremarkable processing of 41 prior Class 9 designations, without a single one of them ever generating so much as a follow-up inquiry, read the documentation package personally, and read it with the particular species of professional discomfort that comes from realizing an institution one has served loyally for decades has been operating, in at least one specific and consequential respect, on foundations considerably less solid than one had ever thought to question. The military registration amendment was approved unanimously and without objection because the documentation left the committee genuinely no honest alternative. Humanity's registration tier was revised upward, not by 1 grade, but by 6, placing it on the Assembly's own 11,000-year-old scale. In a capability bracket, the classification formula had simply never been designed to reconcile with a Class 9 containment tier at all. This created, under Assembly regulation, an automatic and mandatory reclassification review, because the formula that generated a species population containment quota could not, by the Assembly's own founding charter, assign a Class 9 designation to any species holding a military registration tier above Class 4. It was quite literally against the Assembly's own oldest and most fundamental law for humanity to remain classified as a pest species once its true capability had been documented and recognized. Nobody had broken this law on purpose. Nobody had needed to. It had simply never previously mattered because no Class 9 species had ever survived long enough to force the contradiction into the light. The reclassification hearing was scheduled for the Assembly's full quarterly session, which meant it would be heard not merely by the Classification Committee, but by the entire body of the Kesh Assembly, all 211 member and observer species, in the Grand Chamber itself. a circular hall built at the Assembly's founding 11,000 years earlier specifically so that no single voice, however powerful, could ever physically dominate the room by standing above the others. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was granted, under standard assembly procedure for any species undergoing formal reclassification, the right to address the full chamber for exactly 10 minutes before the vote was taken. She had spent 3 decades of her career before ever arriving at the Kesh Assembly, believing that the most important skill a diplomat could possess was the ability to persuade. Standing in the center of the Grand Chamber, looking out at 211 species who had spent 11,000 years building an institution that had classified her entire civilization as vermin without a single member ever bothering to actually look at the evidence, she understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that persuasion was not what this moment required at all. The evidence had already done the persuading. What this moment required was simply the truth, stated plainly, in front of everyone who had allowed the lie to stand unexamined for 31 years. She did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to sympathy. She read into the permanent record of the Grand Chamber the exact text of the original First Contact Questionnaire, the exact circumstances under which it had been completed, and the exact 31 years during which not a single member of the Assembly's Classification Committee had ever thought to ask whether a species building 14 worlds and 40 statio NS might possibly deserve a second look. Then she said the only sentence from her 10 minutes that history would remember, delivered not with anger but with the flat, unhurried patience of someone who had spent a year building toward exactly this moment and intended to spend it well. You classified an entire species as vermin based on a form filled out incorrectly by a frightened junior aide in his first week on the job, and then you never checked again for 31 years. I am not here to ask you to be sorry. I am here to ask you to read your own law and follow it. The reclassification vote passed with a margin so overwhelming that the Assembly's own tally system flagged it for manual verification. Because it had never previously recorded a unanimous vote of that scale on any contested classification matter in its full 11,000-year archive. Humanity was reclassified from Class 9 to Class 3, a tier reserved for established, capable, sovereign civilizations, skipping 5 full grades in a single session, a jump the Assembly's own historians would later describe, in the driest possible institutional language, as unprecedented. This alone would have been, for almost any other species in the Assembly's history, the entire story. A wrong righted, a humiliation reversed, a quiet, dignified vindication achieved through patience rather than force. For humanity, it was only the beginning, because Ruth Calloway, sitting in the observation gallery during the reclassification vote with the same careful attention she had once brought to grading essays, had noticed something in the Assembly's own procedural bylaws that nobody else in the chamber, in 11,000 years of operating under them, appeared to have ever noticed at all. The Assembly's presiding seat, the ceremonial and functional chair of the entire governing body, was not, as every member species had assumed for millennia, awarded through election, inheritance, or seniority. It was awarded under a founding provision so old that most of the Assembly's current membership did not know it existed, to whichever member species had, within the preceding calendar cycle, successfully forced the single largest documented correction to the Assembly's own standing law. The provision had been written by the Assembly's founders as a safeguard, a mechanism designed to ensure that the institution would always be led by whichever species had most recently proven itself capable of holding the Assembly accountable to its own rules, rather than by whichever species had simply accumulated the most seniority or the most raw power. It had never been invoked, not once in 11,000 years, because no correction of sufficient scale had ever previously been forced. Humanity's reclassification, a 6th-grade correction to a formula the Assembly had misapplied for 11,000 years across an unknown number of prior Class 9 species, was, by any reasonable reading of the provision's original language, exactly the kind of correction the founders had been describing. Ruth Calloway brought this to Elena Vasquez's attention over what she would later describe, with characteristic understatement, as an unusually interesting cup of tea. Elena read the provision 3 times. Then she asked Ruth the only question that mattered. "Are you certain this has never been used before?" Ruth was certain. She had, over the preceding year, read more of the Assembly's foundational documentation than any living member of any species currently seated in the Grand Chamber, and she had found, in 11,000 years of institutional memory, exactly 0 prior invocations. Elena Vasquez did not file the claim immediately. She spent 3 weeks verifying, with the same patient thoroughness that had built the reclassification case, that the provision was real, unambiguous, and still legally binding, because she understood with the instincts of someone who had spent 6 years learning exactly how this institution worked, that a claim of this magnitude, if it failed on a technicality, would undo every ounce of credibility the reclassification victory had just earned humanity across the entire Assembly. When she was certain, she filed the claim, through the Assembly's own formal channels, exactly as procedure required, asking not for the presiding seat as a demand, but simply for the Assembly's own procedural registrar to confirm, publicly and on the record, whether the provision applied as written. Grand Registrar Kelvath Sorn, who had spent 19 years believing he understood every corner of the institution he served, confirmed after 11 days of what he would later describe to colleagues as the most uncomfortable legal review of his career, that the provision did in fact apply exactly as written, and that under the Assembly's own 11,000-year-old founding law, the human species had, through the documented scale of its reclassification correction, earned the right to aapka. Copy the presiding seat for the coming term. The announcement was not met with war or panic, or any of the dramatic upheaval that 11,000 years of Assembly precedent might have led an outside observer to expect. It was met in the Grand Chamber with something closer to a long, uncomfortable silence, the particular silence of 211 species collectively realizing that an institution they had all assumed operated on settled, unshakable tradition had, in fact, been operating on a law none of them had ever bothered to read closely enough to notice could be invoked at all. Some species objected. A vocal minority led by the delegation of the long-dominant Threl Ascendancy, which had effectively controlled the presiding seat through informal seniority arrangements for the preceding 4 centuries, argued that the provision was archaic, that its invocation was a technicality never intended to be taken seriously, and that a species holding the seat for less than a year of formal Assembly membership could not possibly be trusted with the responsibility the position carried. Elena Vasquez's response to this objection, delivered again from the center of the Grand Chamber, again without raising her voice, became, over the following years, one of the most quoted lines in the Assembly's modern institutional history. "You have held this seat for 4 centuries by agreement rather than by law, because no one before us ever bothered to check whether the law agreed with you. We are not asking for power. We are asking you to follow the same rule you were content to leave unread for 11,000 years, right up until the moment it stopped working in your favor." The Threl Ascendancy's objection was overruled by a procedural vote that once again exposed exactly how few member species had ever actually studied the founding charter they claimed to revere. Humanity assumed the presiding seat of the Kesh Assembly 11 months and 14 days after Ruth Calloway first read a routine classification notice at a borrowed desk and understood, with the particular horror of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching civics, exactly what she was looking at. The first act humanity undertook from the presiding seat was not, as many member species privately feared, an act of retribution against the institution that had classified an entire civilization as vermin for 3 decades without ever checking its own math. It was instead an act of the same quiet, procedural, almost bureaucratic thoroughness that had gotten humanity into the chair in the first place. Elena Vasquez, in her first formal address as presiding delegate, ordered a full audit, conducted by an independent review panel drawn from member species with no prior history of dominant influence over the classification committee. Of every Class 9 designation the Assembly had issued in its full 11,000-year history. The audit took 6 years. It found that of the 41 prior Class 9 designations on record, 38 had been based on first contact questionnaires that had never been reviewed or updated, in some cases for periods exceeding 2,000 years. Of those 38 species, 11 were confirmed to still exist, still classified, still living under population containment quotas calculated from data that had never once been checked against reality. All 11 were reclassified within the audit's final year. 3 of them, upon review of their own actual demonstrated capability, qualified for the same founding provision that had brought humanity to the presiding seat, and declined, each for reasons of their own, to invoke it, a choice Elena Vasquez publicly and repeatedly stated she respected without reservation, because the entire point, she said, of correcting the law had never been to seize what the law allowed. It had been to make sure the law was finally read. Ruth Calloway retired for the second time in her life 8 years after the reclassification vote, having spent the intervening years training an entirely new generation of Assembly registry staff, human and otherwise, in the specific, unglamorous discipline of reading institutional law closely enough to notice when it had quietly stopped being followed. She was asked once, in a rare interview granted late in her life to a documentary team compiling a history of the longest appeal, what she thought humanity's greatest strength had turned out to be. In a galaxy full of species that could outbuild, outarm, and outnumber it on almost every measure that history had traditionally used to decide which civilizations mattered. She thought about the question for a long moment before answering. In the same unhurried, patient voice she had once used to explain civics to teenagers who mostly hadn't wanted to learn it. "We read the fine print," she said. "Everyone else assumed the rules were fixed because the rules had always worked for them exactly the way they expected. We were the only ones with nothing to lose by checking whether that was actually true. It turns out an institution can survive 11,000 years of being powerful and still never once survive a species patient enough to ask it to follow its own law." The Kesh Assembly, under humanity's first and every subsequent term at the presiding seat, did not become an empire in any sense the Assembly's oldest members would have recognized from their own history. It became, instead, the thing its founders had apparently always intended it to be and had simply never gotten around to enforcing. An institution finally held to the letter of its own founding law, by the one species in 11,000 years that had bothered to read it closely enough to notice the door had been left unlocked the entire time. And somewhere in the Assembly's vast, ancient archive, alongside 11,000 years of classification records, treaties, and forgotten provisions, sat a single amended file, humanity's original first contact questionnaire corrected at last, with a small handwritten annotation added at Ruth Calloway's personal insistence to the bottom of the final page. A note that every registry clerk trained under her tenure was required to read before beginning their own service to the Assembly.